Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's really good to be with you here this evening, and to be invited to talk a bit about peacemaking after Brexit. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to add from what Linda has said there. Yeah, it's been a joy to be involved in several different things over the years. Been part of Crucible and Urban Expression, and working with the Mennonite Trust previously. And yeah, the journey has taken me on to working with refugees in more recent years, and that's been a really interesting learning curve for me. I guess, you know, the commonality between a lot of our organisations is that we do focus on peacemaking, trying to understand what peace looks like, and you know, I guess that's been the focus of what I've been trying to do in working with refugees, many of whom are stuck at the borders, many of whom are trying to find peace in their lives, and working out how to do that, really. So as Linda said, I'm going to present something to begin with, just to kind of give us something to be thinking about in our groups together. I'll try and post a few little links in the chat, and I would encourage you to use the chat as a way of raising any questions or making any comments, and then we can kind of draw those in a little bit later. I always find it's quite difficult as a presenter to also keep an eye on the chat box. So those of you that are regulars here, you know, feel free to keep an eye on the chat box and, you know, highlight any questions that you think it might be worth coming back to at a later stage. But it's quite useful to use the chat just to kind of list those that are there. Most recently, the organisation that I've ended up working with and founding is called Peaceful Borders. I'm just going to put a link here. Oh, that didn't work. That's a shame. Let me try again. I'm just going to put the link for Peaceful Borders into the chat. Hopefully. Oh, hang on 1 second. Here we go, peacefulborders.org. There you go, that's in the chat box. And yeah, so Peaceful Borders seeks to accompany and equip people who are responding to forced migration. And there's 4 areas that we focus on at the moment. So one is accompanying peacemakers. Second one is building capacity to respond to the issues that they face. Thirdly, campaigning on issues that particularly affect asylum seekers and refugees. And then D, developing projects. So developing good ideas, basically. It started off with me going off to the Calais jungle, really in search of truth, really, trying to find out what was happening there back in 2015, trying to get to the bottom of some of the narratives that were going on there, and yeah, being quite overwhelmed really at the realities of situation who are at our border and some of the injustices that they were facing. Gone on to be involved in supporting quite a lot of campaigns, especially for children to be reunited with family who are here in the UK, and that's something that we focus on quite a lot through Peaceful Borders. And there's other things that we've ended up doing as well. So one of the guys that works with us, he was a community leader in the Calais jungle, originally from Sudan, and he remains a community leader now that he's here in London, and he's organised a weekly support group for other refugees and asylum seekers called Hope Towns. So we've been supporting him because it's a great idea and trying to build his capacity to do that. And you know, obviously in the light of the pandemic, we've all had to adjust to that, and Hope Towns has had to change the way it works. So some of our work in the most recent months has been about responding to COVID-19. It's been about providing food and necessities for asylum seekers and refugees. Just recently, we've put together a whole load of education packs that we're going to deliver to people. And we experimented with doing a few things out in the open, in parks, like barbecues for people to get together. That's been scuppered recently with the whole rule of 6. And we've just been just about to launch a new project as well called Project Pause, and I'll put the link here in the chat for you as well. Project Pause is it's a storytelling project, really, recognising that perhaps those of us in the middle of the pandemic are beginning to have a little taste of what people who are displaced experience on a regular basis. So the fact that we've maybe not been able to see family, perhaps we're separated from people when they're ill, perhaps we're not able to communicate with people as much as we would like. All of those things are issues that displaced people face all the time, actually, and have wisdom that they can share into that. And then just recently as well, we just find ourselves responding a little bit to the increase in the number of boats that are coming across the channel. There's actually there's a narrative that's saying that the number of people coming to the UK for asylum has increased recently. The truth is that it hasn't increased at all. The numbers have stayed fairly static, but some of their methods have changed. And the boat seems to be the method of choice at the moment. That's partly because the lorries that used to bring people are now getting stuck in Calais, so people aren't wanting to risk journeying on a lorry that might not move anywhere very quickly. So that's a little bit about what I've been involved in, and I guess in terms of setting the scene of our theme this evening, so exploring being a peacemaker in transitional times. How might we resist scapegoating, polarising and dehumanising tendencies while remaining committed to peace and justice? And I think for me, this topic really comes out of the fact that, you know, at the borders of our nations or at the borders of our lives, those are really interesting places, aren't they? When we are in a border land, it's sometimes uncomfortable, because they tend to be contested spaces. There is space in between. And in Peaceful Borders, we talk a little bit about working in the spaces in between. And I guess whether you're at the border of a country or whether you are at the border of a life that is very different to yours, at that border, there is perhaps discomfort, or there is intrigue, or there is fear, or there is apprehension, or there is learning. All of these things happen there, and we might find ourselves asking questions at borders. We might ask, well, how do I behave here in this contested transitional space? We might ask questions of, well, who's in charge here? We might ask questions about what our parameters are in this space, or we might ask, what other stories have informed this space and created this tension or this border? There's always history behind borders. And I guess in terms of theological reflection, being in between things is not something that we're unfamiliar with. Many of us will be familiar with you know, the theology of being in between the now and the not yet, and the tension of, well, what is now and what is not yet, and how do we behave in the now and the not yet, and what's the priority and what are the parameters. And there's sometimes discomfort in that, and there's disagreement in that for us as well. So that's not unfamiliar for us. And I guess here in the UK at the minute, we are in between several different things. Perhaps in the chat box, you could have a little think, you know, how do you feel when you're in a transitionary time? There might be some feelings that come up there. And what kind of transitionary times do we find ourselves in here in the UK? So I'll throw in some examples, but if you can think of anything else, then throw it into the chat there. So as an example, we are in the EU withdrawal transitionary period. We have technically left the EU, but we're still in that transitionary period for another couple of months till the end of 2020. What does that mean? It actually means there's quite a bit of uncertainty. Who's in charge? Whose rules are we following? Who's making the decisions about those things? There's lots and lots of negotiations that we're acutely aware of in the news. There are deals being brokered, possibly broken, left, right and centre, aren't there? And with the intensity of of the negotiation process coming towards an end, there's a lot of posturing going on by people who don't want to make the first move. It's a big game of chicken, isn't it, really? Like, who's gonna give up first? Nobody wants to give up their own priorities and their own self-interests. So that's a really interesting period that we're in. Of course, in the last 6-7 months, we've been in the COVID-19 pandemic as well. What an incredible time of transition that has been, and continues to be for us, when we just don't know what one week is going to hold to the next. You know, we don't know whether to book a holiday, to book a flight, because the chances are that we're going to have to self-isolate when we come home. There's even uncertainties now about the number of tests that are available and how many people you can meet with, and whether you can still go down to the pub, and whether churches can open, and you know, so many questions still up in the air. And with that comes, no doubt for all of us to some extent, a sense of loss, a sense of trauma, a real sense of caution with all the changing restrictions, a sense of new normals that we just get our head around and then perhaps it changes again. And I can see in the chat there's comments here about, you know, transition tends to be a time of stress and uncertainty and insecurity, and you know, 100% I'm sure we're all experiencing that to some degree or another in the pandemic. Another transitionary time that we are in, probably as a result of both of these elements, is a massive change in terms of employment patterns. Some people are saying we're experiencing the greatest change in business and employment since the Industrial Revolution. That's just huge. So obviously there's been a large amount of unemployment. It's going to be very interesting within the next few days that we will hear more and more about unemployment, because the furlough scheme is coming to an end and many businesses are having to give notice now of redundancies. So that news is beginning to filter through. There are some predictions from some places that we may be entering a depression. We wait and see about that. And of course, there are concerns there about the effects on young people in particular, who are suffering in lots of different ways with the pandemic. But what that's going to mean in terms of employability and opportunity and all that kind of stuff. So a number of transitions are going on for us. Some people are suggesting that's really quite a perfect storm of issues. And actually, that's not even mentioning other things that are probably quite predictable for us. You know, I mean, January, we always have floods at some part in the country, don't we? That's kind of quite a normal thing now. They always seem to surprise us, but actually it's very regular that we have floods. No doubt an effect of climate change, for which there are ongoing campaigns by Extinction Rebellion, and obviously ongoing campaigns on other issues of justice like Black Lives Matter. So a number of issues are all in that melting pot. We may say, well, that's always the case. There's always issues going on. There's always something to discuss and to debate and to change, and that's true. But it might be that you know, the extent and the depth of those issues are really quite a challenge, and also make it an incredibly transitionary time for all of us. It's interesting though that in a perfect storm of transitionary times, there are still people that win. There are winners and losers in everything. PPE makers are probably winners at the minute. Perspex shareholders are probably winners at the minute. And even some local shops are winners. The Co-op announced today that their sales have rocketed in recent times because we've all gone for more local shopping. Obviously, online shopping has rocketed. The number of delivery vans and delivery drivers that we see, and commuters who no longer commute to work and are working from home, are saving a packet. And yeah, I can see cycle shops as well in there as well. So lots of people are winning out of it. And I guess that's my observation in terms of working with refugees and displaced people, that there is immense trauma and transition and suffering for many people. There are also many winners in that. Fence builders, in particular, are big winners with the refugee crisis, because people love building a good fence to stop people camping in certain areas, and barbed wire is being sold by the mile. But there are always losers as well, and often it's those that are scapegoated because of whatever issue we are facing. Either in terms of a narrative that they're given, or actually in terms of, you know, practically and physically the consequences of what they're facing. So obviously refugees will be one. In terms of COVID-19, we know that people of colour have been most likely to die of COVID-19. There are factors there. In the current climate as well, people who are excluded digitally, people that don't have Wi-Fi, people that don't have data, people that only have a little brick phone and don't have a smartphone, are really suffering in all of this, because they cannot have a video appointment with their GP. They cannot continue to bid for a council house that they're trying to get, because you have to do it online. They can't apply for jobs. They can't check their benefits are okay, because they don't have enough data. And, you know, perhaps they used to rely on going to the library for the free Wi-Fi, but the libraries have been closed for 6 months. You know, so there's always winners and losers. And as we've said, in times of transition, things often feel unsettled, unclear, there's confusion. And there's kind of really polar feelings that we feel. So there's an insecurity and there's a caution. And yet even our Prime Minister was saying yesterday, we need to be cautious but confident. And on the surface you go, what does that mean? How can you be cautious and confident? And yet I kind of understand him, because we do need to be cautious, but also if we want to build for the future, you know, we do need to help people become confident again, to be able to go out, to get on the trains, to go shopping, to, you know, to get the economy going. I understand that. We talk about brokenness, and yet we also talk about resilience. I read a lovely article the other day about, you know, the things that our young people are learning in the midst of all the trauma and all the mess around, you know, their grades and whether they can get to university or not, and whether they have any job prospects and mental health and all of that. On the other side, the flip side of that is the resilience that they're learning. And again, we often talk about that in terms of refugees. They've learned amazing skills through the displacement, out of the necessity of learning new things. And there are other things that we learn as well. So in these contested times and contested spaces, there might be weakness and strength. There are those that feel weak, those that feel strong, but perhaps we have to learn to lean on each other a little bit. There is fear, there is trust. We have to trust people that we don't necessarily normally trust. And, you know, we've seen that an awful lot in recent times with the emergence of all the mutual aid groups that have started, the neighbourhood groups that have started, the WhatsApp groups in the neighbours, where people have started helping each other and done shopping for each other and all of that kind of stuff. You know, a bit of fear, but also a need to trust people that we wouldn't normally have trusted. And I guess in these kind of border places, whether they're physical or mental and emotional, there is a sense sometimes of entrapment, that we're trapped in this situation that we haven't chosen. And also what comes with that is sometimes a sense of freedom and creativity, actually, of like, well, we're in this situation, we might as well make something work, and let's be creative. What can we do? I know we can go out and clap for carers, or I know we can sing songs together down our street, or do you know, there's a creativity that comes with it, because I think there's a freedom to change our mind and to change our mindset. There's just throw in one story about this, actually. So I didn't vote for Brexit, and it's always caused me quite a lot of angst that we're leaving the EU. I guess I've always thought of the European Union as a success story, and that we are leaving that behind. But I had a conversation with a Conservative MP in a group earlier in the week, and it was really interesting because he said that he was a very proud Brexiteer. And we were having conversations about the fire that took place in the Moria refugee camp in Lesbos, that burnt down a camp that was built for 3,000 people and has been housing 13,000 people. And it burnt down just like 10 days ago or so. And 13,000 people were made homeless overnight. And he was saying that the Moria camp was evidence of the EU being a failed experiment. Because if the EU was working, we would not have huge refugee camps like that. We would be sharing them out. We would be looking after them, etc., etc. And I was really challenged by that. I hadn't thought of it like that before, and I need to ponder that, because I can see where he's coming from with that. So there's a question. I'm just going to put this in the chat for you as well. And again, perhaps you might want to be thinking a little bit about this. And we might chat about this in our groups, but also you can put your responses in the chat box if you like as well. So I wonder if there is a space or a place, physical or otherwise, that feels like an in-between or transitionary place for you. Yeah, just wonder whether anything comes to mind for you. It doesn't have to be as grand as a refugee camp. You know, it could be a certain place in your town, a certain shop, a certain location, or I don't know, or a certain encounter. I don't know. And what feels transitionary for you? And just for another few minutes before we are going to break into groups shortly, but I just want us to think again theologically about some of what we are talking about here. And I guess I've been drawn to a theological thinking about what it means to be a scapegoat. And that will be familiar to many of us if we have a church or a religious background. The story of the scapegoat comes up mostly in Leviticus 16, comes up in the story of the Day of Atonement, where the people of Israel confessed their sins in order to become right with God. And one of the things they did on that day was to confess their sins onto a goat, onto the scapegoat. There was a sense of transferring their sin and their guilt and their shame, their wrongdoings onto this animal. And then what's really interesting is for that particular animal, that was then led out by somebody into the middle of nowhere, and it was released. And there's some thinking that it was released in order for it to go and die. There is some thinking that maybe it was released in order, you know, just for fate to take its place. It might live, it might die, who knows. I was just reflecting on this week, because there's been some really disturbing things happening in terms of refugees and asylum seekers, for whom the pandemic has really slowed down their asylum seeking processes. So there's many people who have arrived in the UK who have an absolutely legal right to claim asylum, and for that to be considered with due process. And because the processes have all slowed down, many of them are just being put up in temporary accommodation, waiting and waiting and waiting. But just in the last week or so, there's been a new scheme by the Home Office, which is removing people who have arrived by boat. And there was a plane that left last week with a whole load of guys. 11 of them were Syrians. And we know that, you know, if a Syrian comes to the UK, 100% they are guaranteed asylum, because they cannot return. And these guys were deported, having not been able to access the legal system, and they were deported to Spain just because they happened to have gone through Spain at another time. They turned up in Spain, and the authorities in Madrid decided to just make them destitute. They didn't let them enter their system at all. And it just gave me this sense of, very often refugees are scapegoated, that we're told that they are the problem. And very often they are picked up and removed from certain places, whether it's Calais, whether it's Madrid, whether it's anywhere, removed and literally taken to the middle of nowhere and released, and literally have to walk back again. We saw this many, many, many times in Calais, that the police would pick people up, perhaps having found them trying to get into a lorry, or just found them in the centre of Calais, and they just took them, beat them up, took away their shoes, took them to the middle of France and just dropped them off in the middle of nowhere. And it really made me resonate with this sense of scapegoat, that people were literally abandoned in different places. And I wondered, where is the purity in that? There's a purity for us of I want to be clean, I want to be righteous, but not you. I'm going to transfer the issue to you. It's your issue. You shouldn't have come here. You're the problem, not me. You're in the wrong. You are the other. It's not us. And it just made me think as well about what it feels like to be scapegoated, and we can discuss some of this in the group shortly. I wonder what it feels like to be scapegoated, and I think it depends a bit on the power that you have. If you have power, you probably haven't had much experience of being scapegoated, certainly less experience, but also you might not care very much about being scapegoated. There's plenty of people who are scapegoating Donald Trump, who are blaming senior figures in governments all around the world. But actually, if you have a lot of power, you probably don't care too much if people want to scapegoat you. But there are others for whom it will really affect significantly. There is often a sense of feeling dehumanized. And again, using the refugee example, we often see that of people holding up signs like, I'm human too, have you not forgotten I'm a human being? And in the Black Lives Matters protests, we've seen that as well. Like, am I not human? Am I allowed to be treated differently? And another feeling I think that is probably felt when someone is scapegoated is this sense of, I can't win. Like, what do you expect me to do? There is no solution here. If I stay here, I'm in trouble. If I go there, I'm in trouble. There is no win. And I certainly remember hearing many asylum seekers and refugees in Calais and elsewhere, when they're asked, well, why would you risk getting in a boat across the Channel or across the Mediterranean? Why would you even contemplate that? They would say, we either die here or we die there. Like, basically, we're going to die, so we might as well die trying to find safety. So in terms of how to resist scapegoating, let me just mention 3 things, and then we'll go straight into groups. So, and we can come back and revisit these later if we want to. You might want to kind of expand on these, but I would like to suggest 3 things that we can do to resist the tendency, the very human tendency, to scapegoat, polarize and dehumanize. The first one is, I think we need more we and less me. More we and less me. I think one of the things the pandemic has shown us is that we are in this together. I think perhaps one of the reasons we've pulled together, and perhaps we've found the strength not to moan too much about our situations, is that we know we're all in this together. I hear lots of people say, how's it been through the pandemic for you? And they'll say, I know I mustn't complain because there are people in far worse situations than me, but working at home has been really hard, But we know that in comparison to others, we've not had it so bad, perhaps, because obviously so many people have lost their lives, or who are long-term ill, or haven't been able to see anybody for a long time, etc. So there's this sense of being in it together, this commonality, a relational strength that has come, like I said before, through the COVID response, mutual aid groups in particular. There's been less scapegoating, because how do you scapegoat a pandemic? You know, you can't blame anybody for it. And also there's a real sense that my survival depends on you. You know, I wear a mask when I go out because I want to protect you, but also it's because I know I need you to protect me. You know, for all those nurses and doctors who have cared for people at their end of life when their relatives haven't been able to get in to see them, you know, there's been this sense of, you know, I need to rely on other people to care for people when I can't be there. There's been some really beautiful examples of humanity in the midst of that, and I think we need to hold on to that humanity. I remember a story about a guy who was in the Filipino border force, and he was there at a time when there were numerous people coming over in boats from Vietnam. And I mean, this is many, many years ago, and he was an old man, and he was talking about the times when he was under instruction in a border force boat to give people in boats water, but then to push them away. And he has had to cope with that for the rest of his life, knowing that he had done that to many, many people who probably, you know, they would have died as a result of that. There are personal stories that everybody is a human being, even people who treat other people really badly. But there are systemic issues that we may want to be thinking about. But if we can think more we and less me, we might have the opportunity to build those bridges, to create presence with people who are different to us, and to form a shared story. Perhaps we can transgress some of the borders that we shouldn't be expecting to cross. But actually, when we cross them, we discover that we can be more we and less me, that we have more in common than we otherwise thought. Second thing is to have more listening and less judging. To make sure that we are listening and understanding people before we judge them. I mentioned the Conservative MP that I spoke to before. You know, that's made me think, and I mustn't judge politicians who I feel have a different view to me. I remember another story from the Calais jungle. As the Calais jungle was really growing to about 10,000 people, it was really, you know, a suburb of Calais. And someone came up with the idea of contacting Google to see if they would come and put the jungle on the map, and to, you know, send a little car around and get the Calais jungle on Google Maps. And I remember being part of a community discussion about this. And one of the topics that came up was, well, you know, what do we do if people in the camp get caught by the camera? You know, is that potentially going to affect someone's asylum claim if then, you know, somehow the Home Office can discover that you were in Calais at a certain time because you're on the Google map, and etc. And then a well-meaning volunteer piped up and said, well, actually, you know, if, you know, maybe all the refugees should come out onto the street if the Google car comes down, and we can all wave and smile, and like we can show everybody that refugees are really nice people. And this volunteer thought they'd come up with a really great idea. And one of the community leaders just completely lost it. He was so angry because he was just saying, why should we always be having to prove that we are nice people? Where does that come from, that we have to prove, just because we're from Afghanistan, just because we're from Iraq, Syria, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia? Why do we have to prove that we're nice people? Why don't people just assume that we're nice people like we assume of others? And I just thought that was a massive challenge. And actually, it's about listening. It's about getting to know people rather than judging. There's a quote here from Evelyn Beatrice Hall, wrote of the philosopher Voltaire. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And I think this is true. We have to defend people's right to say whatever they believe. And even if we disagree, they have a right to say that. And it's the beginning of a conversation, hopefully the beginning of a dialogue. And the third and final point here is I would suggest also that in these contested spaces, one way to avoid scapegoating, polarising, dehumanising is to have more organising and less agonising. It's really easy to agonise over situations we find ourselves in, and in particular at the moment, you know, when we're facing changes on a weekly basis and such insecurities and anxiety about our own personal situations, our families, those we care for in our communities, it's easy to agonise over that. But one thing I have learned is that agonising doesn't change anything. Organising changes things. And actually, if we see things that are not not the way things should be, you know, as we work towards a world as it should be, as we're in this in-between time of the way the world is and the way it should be, if we see things that should be different, the way to work towards those is to organise together, to look at systemic changes, to listen to the issues, to break a big problem down into manageable issues where there is a solution, and then to plan and to act and to negotiate for that solution to happen. And so those three things, I think, are ways that we can perhaps work towards being more human and less scapegoating and less polarising. So given all of that, it would be great if we could break into some groups. And I'm just going to put a couple of questions in the chat box here for you now. So the first question is one that we mentioned earlier. So it's, you know, is there a place or a space, physical or otherwise, that feels in between or transitionary for you? If you want to share that, you're very welcome to. No pressure if you don't want to. Also, secondly, have you ever felt scapegoated? Or have you ever observed scapegoating? And how did it feel? Maybe you just want to share a little story about that. And then a third question is, what is one polarising issue that you personally would like to see more dialogue around? And it doesn't have to be about anything that I've mentioned so far. It can be completely different to what we've talked about. But is there a polarising issue that you would like to see more dialogue around? So in your groups, you may want to tackle all three, or you may just want to go around your groups and, you know, respond to whichever question you're connecting with, and see where you go from there. I think we're going to have about 25 minutes or so, 25-30 minutes in groups, and then we're going to come back and we'll have a bit of discussion, and then I've got a few points just to kind of wrap us up for the evening. So hopefully that sounds okay. Linda, shall I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
See how long that takes. There might be time at the end just for like a few final questions or comments. So I guess in terms of scapegoating, one of the things that I have also come back to a little bit in thinking is, I guess, you know, for us with, you know, perhaps we connect with Christian story or religious story, is the story of Jesus being scapegoated. So I've been reading the account in Matthew 27 of the trial of Jesus again, and you know, looking at how Jesus was taken before the Sanhedrin, who were looking for false evidence to sentence him to death. And it really clearly says that they were looking for false evidence to sentence him to death. And you know, they managed to find some evidence, some loose evidence, and then they take him to Pilate. And as is before Pilate, the chief priests and the elders persuade the crowd when they're given the choice of, you know, Pilate's clearly trying to get out of this situation. He can smell a rat, I think, and he's trying to get out of the situation that he can see he's being led into. And and he gives the crowd the option of, I normally let you choose somebody to be set free today. Who do you want, Barabbas, this clear criminal, or Jesus? And the chief priests and the elders, it says, persuade the crowd to call for Barabbas. And then, of course, you've got that really interesting moment where Pilate, perhaps trying to absolve himself from any responsibility in this, washes his hands. And so it's not my doing, it's not my fault. Does he in turn scapegoat the Jews? It's like, it's your fault, you picked him, you picked him, and I gave you the option and you picked him, so it's nothing to do with me. And there were loads of things kind of resounding through my head of some recent experiences and recent narratives. The cases of COVID-19 are increasing, and we hear things like, well, you went out to eat out to help out too much, and that's why that's why it's going up. I told you all to go and eat out to help out, but I didn't really mean you to go and do it so much. And maybe it's our fault now that it's increasing again. On the one hand, we're told to get the economy going by going back to work in our office, and yet now perhaps the commuters are being blamed. People are encouraged to go and get tests for COVID, and even just this week we're told, well, there's people going for tests who don't need them. There's just like this perpetual blaming somebody for something, and I guess it's just been going on all the time, hasn't it? And we see that from Jesus being scapegoated there. Dwight Eisenhower, one of the US presidents, he said, the search for a scapegoat is the easiest of all hunting expeditions. Which is quite interesting, given that we all have to abide by the rule of 6, apart from those who are hunting at the moment. But it is easy for all of us to search for a scapegoat and to find one. And I guess I've just been reflecting as well on this call that in Hebrews, that Jesus is the final scapegoat, and just wondering what does that mean, that Jesus is the final scapegoat in this context. Does that mean that we don't need a scapegoat anymore, and we shouldn't be looking for scapegoats? Does it mean that he was the final scapegoat because he took all of the sins that we put on him and resolved them? Or is it because he's saying we just really should not be scapegoating anyone anymore? But we still do. It's human nature. We like to blame others. And I guess as a final thought, I then moved along to Matthew 7, and the Sermon on the Mount has so much richness to it, and I'm sure we're all familiar with it or with parts of it. But I was really struck by the passage about not judging, and just connecting that with resisting the tendency to scapegoat and to polarize and dehumanize. And just reminded in Matthew 7, don't judge. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of dust in your neighbour's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? And I'm challenged by that. I have no answers to it. I recognise my own tendency to scapegoat and to blame, but I want to try and resist that. And I need help from other people to try and resist that, and we need help from one another to do that. So let me just pause there, as our time is rapidly coming to an end, but let me throw that open to any